Hi everyone, Blake here with a special announcement before we get into the episode. We're doing a viewer's choice movie special for our second episode later in November. If you have a pre-2000s movie you love, or an old movie you've never seen before but would be interested in hearing more about, let us know. You can reach us on our Facebook page, our Twitter page, our Podbean channel, or our YouTube channel. Just look for Vintage Cinema Rewind, basically anywhere you can find a podcast. I'm really excited to hear what you come up with. Alright, now back to the show. I think we're good to go, so if you want to spend a few minutes to think about, you're good?
I'm good. Let's
You
do
can
it.
wing it? All right.
Yeah, dude.
All right.
I enjoy a challenge.
Welcome to VCR, a Vintage Cinema Rewind. We're bringing old movies to new viewers. I'm Blake.
And I'm Michael.
Hey! And we even figured out your name this time.
That's right. I think I beat that joke into the ground.
Definitely. You absolutely did.
Yeah.
And this week, we've got the movie Platoon from 1987 that we're doing.
1986.
What?
Yeah, it's 86.
Oh, shit. I wrote that
You
down
don't
wrong.
cut this out.
No, I'm cutting it down.
Don't cut it out.
I'm cutting it.
It'll make you seem more approachable.
Like less of a know-it-all, eh?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
But cut out all my mistakes.
Well, we're doing Platoon from 1986. So, I guess let's start with the plot. Let's just dive right in.
All right, let's do it.
This is a heavy movie.
Yeah, just a little. It's got some heft to it. Okay, so Charlie Tiger Blood Sheen plays Chris Taylor, a new recruit in the Vietnam War. And as the movie unfolds, he finds himself caught between two superior authors who serve as kind of father figures to him. One is Sergeant Elias, played by the always fantastic Willem Dafoe, and the other is Lieutenant Barnes, played by Tom Berenger. Am I saying that wrong?
Tom Berenger.
Tom Berenger. Don't cut this out. Yeah. And what unfolds is almost kind of a spiritual fable about the nature of good and evil against the backdrop of one of the most controversial wars of the 20th century.
Yeah, and taking a very realistic approach to what the war in Vietnam was like. Oliver Stone, I'm kind of getting into the characters and people you may know stuff already, but Oliver Stone, the director behind this, was actually a Vietnam War vet. A lot of the scenes and moments in this film were actually drawn from experiences that he had during the war.
Yeah, this is definitely one of the most unglamorous, grittiest portrayals of what war is actually like.
Yeah, and for that reason, it's really cool. It's something that's really special, and this is definitely an old movie that I think we're going to have a lot of stuff to talk about when we get into a lot of different areas, and who this is for, and where this fits into cinematic history as well.
Absolutely.
I'm really excited to talk about this film.
Okay.
I watched this a couple weeks ago now because of our scheduling issues that you and I had.
Mostly your fault.
Yeah, almost entirely my fault.
That's right.
But
You blacklisted me from the Cube review. I've just been sitting here waiting.
True. But no, honestly, this film's got so much. There's so much just depth to the film, and there's so many interesting components to it. I think that every single one of our topics that we're going to talk about today is going to be a really interesting discussion. I think this is going to be one of those highlight episodes where there's just so many interesting things to talk about that I'm going to have a hard time cutting stuff down.
I can already tell that you and I may have very different opinions of this film.
And I'm excited about that because this film was controversial at the time that it came out too, right?
Certainly was. Certainly was.
So, before we get into all of that and our thoughts on the film, let's break this down for who the characters and people you may know, and then let our modern audiences know who this is for in today's viewing experience. So, characters and people you may know. So, you've already highlighted probably the three most important central characters to the film. What's really interesting about this movie is it almost feels like an ensemble movie, just because of just the sheer number of to-be famous actors there are in this film.
Yeah, you're gonna when you watch this movie, you're gonna have a lot of moments where like, oh hey, I know that guy.
Yeah.
veteran voice actor Keith David appears in this movie.
Yeah, Keith David, one of actually we're big fans of Keith David on the podcast since he was Childs in The Thing, movie we've already covered. I believe he's in at least one other film that we've covered on the podcast of recent, or another film that I just watched this year, and also obviously on Community as well. So I've become
right.
Keith David's a weird actor for me because I saw him in Community first and was like, oh yeah, like he's cool in Community or whatever. But then ended up going back into his filmography and really enjoying like all of the films that he's been in and, starred in.
This is so random, but for some reason I was watching a clip from Agent Cody Banks recently. Do you remember with the kid from Malcolm in the Middle?
I don't remember his name.
Yeah, I don't remember his name either. But Keith freaking David is like his secret agent handler in that movie. Yeah,
that's so random. It was Frankie Muniz. That's the name.
Frankie Muniz. Yeah. And I was looking at it like, okay, hi Keith David, what are you doing here? I feel like he's kind of. Whenever he shows up, it's like you're running into a friend at a bar or something. You're just like, oh, hey, Keith David. Like, pull up a chair, buddy.
Yeah,
like,
I'm always happy to see him in films.
Yeah,
for sure.
and also just, I mean, despite appearances, I'm a very heterosexual male, but goddamn, that is one of the silkiest, most captivating voices that God has ever created.
Yeah, it's up there. It's like James Earl Jones almost quality.
Oh, yeah. Like, for those of you who don't know, he was Goliath in Gargoyles, and most recently he's President Curtis in Rick and Morty.
I love the fact that when I woke up this morning, I had no idea that Gargoyles was going to be a part of the Platoon podcast.
Well,
but I should have expected it from you.
Look, when you invite me on, you expect the unexpected.
All right, we are way off topic right now.
I want to keep talking about Keith David.
No, we have so many other actors to talk about. But first, let's talk about the three main actors, even though you kind of already briefly mentioned them. So Chris Taylor, played by Charlie Sheen. We don't need to talk about who Charlie Sheen is. Everybody on the planet knows who Charlie Sheen is.
Can we
for better or worse.
just not to cut you off, but
yeah.
Can we talk about just how freaking surreal it is to see Charlie Sheen in a dramatic role?
And you know what? Like, he's in several of those in this time period, and they're all pretty good movies.
Well, it's just funny because you and I are both, we're around the same age. I turned 30. I feel like our earliest point of contact with Charlie Tiger Blood Sheen was 2.5 Men.
Oh, absolutely it was.
Right, and then he famously went insane 10 years ago, and then... now, and then I booted up Platoon, and I was like, oh, hey, Martin Sheen. And I was like, wait, what? Like,
yeah. and it's really like a reflection of another Vietnam War movie, which we'll talk about later. Obviously,
Absolutely.
Apocalypse Now. But so Chris Taylor, the character, is very fresh on the ground. This is his first tour in Vietnam. He's a really interesting character because he's not the typical soldier type. And that comes up kind of frequently in his character development.
He's a bit more... He's from a wealthier family, and I believe he's like a university or college dropout.
Yeah, he dropped out to go join the war.
Right, whereas a lot of the recruits are from slightly disadvantaged backgrounds. Mm-hmm. He's kind of... he's... like a prep school city boy or something.
Exactly. And at one point, like, he's even called like a crusader because he's very idealistic about what war is and what it should be. And that comes into conflict, especially with Sergeant Barnes, who we'll talk about.
The impression I got from Charlie Sheen's character is that, like, he's almost kind of like Holden Caulfield from The Catcher in the Rye, right? Like, wealthy background, moderately intelligent, feels slightly disillusioned with society, and he just kind of joined up because he had nothing better to do.
Yeah,
that may not be the correct interpretation, but that's my interpretation.
I don't necessarily agree with that interpretation, but that's fine. We'll move on. Maybe we'll come back to that later. So Sergeant Barnes, maybe the next character we'll talk about. Definitely the more cynical leader of the group. The structure of the platoon's a little interesting, and it might be kind of difficult on first viewing to fully understand. There's Chris, who's one of the new recruits in the platoon. There is a lieutenant who's supposed to be in control of the platoon, but he's pretty inexperienced, and so he often defers to his two sergeants, Sergeant Barnes and Sergeant Elias, to make decisions.
There's a really interesting scene early in the film when Barnes starts barking orders, and then afterwards the lieutenant pulls him aside. He's like, it'd probably be better if I was seen giving orders. Yeah. And Barnes just very sarcastically is like, yes, sir.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Those kind of conflicts is really interesting to see the different personalities clash with each other, and that power struggle as well between the lieutenant and his two sergeants, and then even between the two sergeants themselves. So like I said, Sergeant Barnes, the more cynical leader, played by Tom Berenger, who is an actor that I actually didn't really know a lot of his filmography before.
I'm not really familiar with anything else he's done.
You are actually. He was in and everybody in the modern audiences are going to actually know him from one film in particular, Inception, where he plays Peter Browning, who was Cillian Murphy's godfather, the one that they kind of impersonate. It's been a while. If it's been a while since you watched that film, you might not know who I'm talking about exactly, but as soon as you start watching that film, you'll know exactly who I'm talking about. He's older in this too, right? Like, he's older in Inception, obviously.
He's also, I feel like he's just one of those guys who, like, he probably has always looked 40.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. He was also in the 4-hour and 14-minute movie Gettysburg, which is one of his personal favorites from the 90s.
Okay.
And he was also a big part of the Sniper film series, a film series which I'd never heard of, but...
Isn't that Mark Wahlberg?
No, it's him and Billy Zane, actually.
Billy Zane? You mean Mr. Hairline from Titanic?
Exactly. I thought you'd be interested to hear that. I've never seen those movies, but there's like 9 of them or something.
What the...
from
the
90s.
H? Okay.
Maybe not my sphere of film necessarily, but the people who know Tom Berenger know and love Tom Berenger.
He has a very cinematic presence.
Yeah, he's got like a rugged face. Like, obviously there was some prosthetics that were put, like that scar was really cool.
He's got like a very disfigured, I think it's the left or right side of his face.
Yeah.
So he really looks like a grizzled sergeant from Vietnam in this movie.
Exactly. And so the character that he most often clashes with is Sergeant Elias, the more idealistic, compassionate leader who we see has a very different approach to war, and even like how he maybe steps out of war and relaxes a little bit as well, played by Willem Dafoe in his 7th credited role. This is a really great Willem Dafoe performance, and I want to highlight that before we go into that. Like we were saying right before this podcast started, every time I see Willem Dafoe in a movie, up until that point, I forget how great of an actor and how much I respect him as an actor. And then I watch the movie and I'm like, God damn, Willem Dafoe does it again. He's just like incredible in every movie.
He really is. Maybe for the younger people listening to this, you probably recognize him as Norman Osborn from the first 3 Spider-Man movies.
Yeah, the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man series, the trilogy, the Green Goblin. Definitely one of his most iconic roles and one he's most known for. Personally, my favorite film of his is The Boondock Saints, which I just rewatched, where he plays a unhinged FBI agent. It's one of my favorite performances of all time, probably.
Right. You showed me that movie like 10 years ago and I was kind of lukewarm on it.
I love it. Yeah, Jess and I were watching it, and then all week we've been just repeating to ourselves, and then there was a firefight!
I do remember that part vividly.
Yeah, great movie and all-time one of my favorite performances. And then the other appearances, we're not going to go too deep into these just because there's actually a lot, but you're probably going to know most of these names anyway, and if you don't, I have a couple of mentions for where you might know them from. So we've got Forrest Whitaker.
Hey.
Johnny Depp in one of his first film roles ever at the age of 22.
Yeah, God, he looks 12 in this movie.
You almost blink and you almost miss him too.
Yeah, he's not a major character. You're just like, he starts talking in one scene. He's a translator. You're just like, that's not Johnny Depp, is it?
yeah, exactly.
Like,
Kevin Dillon, in a very young Kevin Dillon, who you would actually know from Entourage, as well as Matt Dillon's brother, another big actor. John C. McGinley, who you would know as Perry Cox from Scrubs, most likely.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Dr. Cox. He's great in this movie.
He is great in this movie. Everybody's great. The performances are, like, you're not going to complain about any performance, I don't think, in this film.
Actually, I have one big complaint, but I'll save that.
All right, we'll save that until we get into spoiler talk. Mark Moses, who plays the lieutenant in this film, his face, I was like, I know who that is. He plays Duck Phillips in Mad Men, so very relevant in that sphere of TV. Keith David, who we already mentioned. Tony Todd, who's a strong voice acting has a strong voice acting career. I didn't write a lot down about him. I did highlight one thing, though, that's relevant to you and I. He was the narrator in the Legend of Dragoon game in any of the cutscenes. Yeah.
Oh, my God.
So, kind of neat. Very only relevant to probably you and I in a very niche group of people, but...
Fantastic.
And the last person I'm going to highlight is Corey Glover, who is the singer of Living Colour. And then... director. Obviously, we mentioned Oliver Stone is our director here.
Oliver freaking Stone.
Yeah, we've kind of been hovering around Oliver Stone this year, I feel like. He did Natural Born Killers, which is one of the films that Jason talked about during our draft episode. I think it was his favorite of his three, actually. He also has done several other Vietnam War movies, including Born on the 4th of July, which features Tom Cruise, and Heaven and Earth, which features Tommy Lee Jones. And then...
the two Toms.
Yeah. And then he's also known for some other very prominent films, including JFK, Snowden, and Wall Street. All of those he directed, and I believe wrote most of them, or wrote the adaptations at least. And he also wrote the adaptation for Scarface, one of the most famous films of all time.
That's a great movie.
Yeah, I've seen actually almost all of Oliver Stone's movies that I noted there, which is really funny because his name before we started the podcast wasn't one that was on my mind ever, but pretty prominent director who has very political movies.
Definitely.
And there's some good ones in there. There's some really good gems in there.
Wall Street. I think I may be wrong about this, but I think he said that this was like his favorite movie that he did. Or this was his ultimate passion project. For the process of how long it took him to get this film produced, I would absolutely believe that. Like, the length of time that it took when we get into effects and filming, like, if you weren't passionate about the subject matter, you wouldn't have spent the number of years that you did trying to get this movie made. There's something about Vietnam War movies that seem like they're always a freaking nightmare to get off the ground. Yeah. I mean, the production of Apocalypse Now was so troubled, it famously inspired a documentary. Yeah, I haven't seen it yet, but I really want to watch that documentary for different reasons, each of the films as well. Like, I don't want to compare those as apples to apples because each of these kind of has a different reason for why there was maybe some struggling in the production phase, but we'll talk about that later. This is our spoiler-free for the listener who should watch this kind of section. So, who's this movie for? So obviously, if you're a big fan of war movies, this is a no-brainer for you to check out at some point. Like, this is one of the most famous, probably in the top 10 most famous war movies, I would say, of all time. Maybe top 15. Maybe top 15. It's won a lot of Oscars. It's got a lot of recognition for it. And when we get to the review section, I want to have a discussion with you about Vietnam War movies and kind of maybe even provide like our opinions on which one maybe stands above the rest, because I think that's where you want to compare war movies. I think you should compare them by the actual specific war, because it can get a little bit more difficult to compare movies. I don't know a ton about the historical context of the Vietnam War, but this definitely felt like maybe the most informed, the most realistic. It's definitely up there. Like, I would compare it to, and if we were just going straight war movies, I would compare it to Saving Private Ryan, in the sense that the opening scenes when they storm the beach, there were there were war vets from World War II who were completely devastated rewatching that and commented on how realistic that was to see. Interesting. So I've actually never seen Saving Private Ryan. I can't believe you've never seen Saving Private Ryan. It's like one of the greatest movies of all time. I was a film student too. How did I miss that? I have no idea. That's another movie we'll do on the podcast at some point, I'm sure. Maybe in a little bit, a while. I think I've got some more movies that I want to
talk about before we get to that one, and specifically on the podcast. But in terms of Vietnam War movies, I think if you want a real feel for what it was like to be on the ground of Vietnam during the war, I think this is bar none one of the most interesting films for you to check out.
Yeah, this might be jumping ahead a bit into spoilers, but really the title of the movie Platoon is very appropriate in the sense that a lot of the movie is about the conflict in the lives of the individual members of the platoon themselves.
Right.
There's almost not a whole lot of fighting the Viet Cong in this movie.
No, but when it does happen, and it almost builds up to it at some point, but when it does happen, it is one of the most, I don't know if I want to say iconic, but it's a very hectic, chaotic fight scene near the end of the film, and from what I've read, also stays very true to what being in a war zone at that time was like as well. Like,
absolutely,
there's a lot of realism to this film that there's a reason why this film was preserved for it being historically accurate in a sense, because it's not historically accurate in the sense that it's an accurate portrayal of real life people, but just observing what it was like there and some of the issues that American troops faced and the conflict that they had within each other, like you mentioned, is very apparent in here.
Yeah, I did watch Oliver Stone's appearance on the Joe Rogan podcast, the first one anyway, and I think he said that like he had a hard time getting this movie. A lot of war movies gets financed through like the Pentagon or something.
Yes.
And I guess they wouldn't finance this movie just because of how unglamorous and brutal and how bad they thought it made them look.
Well, this is definitely the most unglorified look at war in film that I've ever seen personally. Or if not the most, it's, and I'm going to contrast this later, but there are movies that definitely can make war look a lot more exciting and heroic and noble, whereas this, it doesn't feel like there are heroes in this film.
No, even the most heroic character is not actually all that heroic when you get right down to it.
Yeah, exactly. And so what I want to say about who this movie's for, I'm also going to say who this movie is not for. I'll say right off the bat, I'm going to spoil this. Jess didn't like this movie. She wrote this off in probably the first 20 minutes, and I can't blame her. Like, this movie is not escapism.
It's not a good time.
No, it's not a film, like, Jess is the kind of person, and I can't fault anybody for this, who wants to watch a movie to escape reality, to find some enjoyment and a pleasant experience to view, something full of wonder maybe, or full of magic, whereas this is a very grounded movie, very gritty, like you said. It's unglorified.
There's no illusions in this movie.
No, it's a focus on realism essentially, and the story of this film is war is hell, and it does terrible things to people. It brings out the worst in people. And at the end of the day, there was no winners in this war. Like, everybody lost. Nobody came out of this looking great.
No, and in fact, when we talk about the ending, I have a lot to say about the ending.
Cool.
Because of that very thing.
Yeah, so I think, is this a movie that's maybe a little bit more niche? It's definitely a more niche war movie, potentially. But I think this, and again, I can't say this has widespread appeal either, but would you say that this film is important enough to understanding what the Vietnam War was like that if you're at all interested in that historical aspect, you should check it out?
Well, I don't know if I can speak to that because, like I said, I don't really know much about the historical context of Vietnam War, despite what the Rambo movies taught me. You know what? Can I just drop a bombshell on you right now?
Sure.
I did not enjoy this movie. Let me rephrase. I admired and respected this movie, but I didn't enjoy it. It's almost, this is a weird comparison, it's almost kind of like 8.5, where I'm like, I see what you're doing here. I'm not necessarily, having a great time watching you do it, but I respect what you're doing.
Yeah, there's going to be almost like a pit in your stomach the entire time you watch this film. You're not going to feel relaxed by the end of this movie.
I don't even know if it was that. I almost, again, this is jumping ahead to my opinion, but
Yeah.
it's almost kind of like the feeling I had watching the John Carpenter movie, The Thing, where I'm just like, again, I really respect what you're doing and what is going on, but I'm just having a hard time connecting to the subject matter.
Okay, that's fair.
It was one of those movies where when it was over, I'm like, good, it's over.
And this is probably why you've never seen Saving Private Ryan.
Yeah, exactly.
At some point, we have to just pick a you-specific movie that you love to give the audience an idea of what your film, what your ideal film is. Because I feel like at this point, the audience has started to develop an idea of what Jason and I really enjoy in the films that would be at the top of our movie list. But we do have to... We need that movie from you still, I think.
I'm a very mysterious guy.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Because honestly, I don't know if I can name any of the movies in your top 10 movie list.
That's fair.
And that might be an interesting discussion for another podcast episode.
Gotta keep you hooked.
Yeah.
The mystique.
So, is there anybody else that this movie is for, do you think, that we haven't talked about at this point?
I think, again, going back to what I said about 8.5, it's like if you really admire the history of cinema, you'll enjoy this movie. This isn't really a movie for most people, I think, nowadays. It's more for people like us, people who care about the history of cinema and how it's developed over the decades. So
yeah, and maybe, you know what, I'm going to bring this up
this
a
movie
bit from my discussion.
certainly isn't as complicated as 8.5, but it's certainly not an easy watch either.
No, it's a social commentary kind of film, and it's a politically charged film. Yeah, it's not a film that has necessarily widespread appeal. It's not like... like I said, I'm gonna bring this up actually from where I was originally planning on discussing this, because I think this is a good time to talk about this. Let's compare it to Apocalypse Now.
Yes.
Apocalypse Now is a cinematically beautiful movie. It's the story of a man on a mission and it's a really interesting mission as he's going through the Vietnam kind of war. We get to see, you know, the beginning of the war, not the beginning of the war in the sense of timeline, but just like he basically lands at the beach at the opening of the big river that goes through Vietnam, and him and his task force that he's with go up the Vietnam River to find Marlon Brando's character and deal with that plot point. And so it's really an interesting film because we start off and it's like America, F yeah, and it's like all the Americans are like there and they're all like, we're kicking ass, this is awesome and everything. Woo. And as the movie goes on, like you see like the chain of command weaken, and you see like as we get further and further into the jungle, how just chaotic and how the war has fallen apart essentially, and that first front that you see is really just that. It's just a front. Like it's just like, you know, Americans are like, it looks like an appearance of like everybody's kicking ass and this war is like so winnable.
It's a facade.
Yeah. And it's cinematically, it's so much more of a compelling and exciting movie. Whereas this, again, like, and that's a movie. I would say Apocalypse Now is a movie, whereas this is like an experience of feeling what it was like to be in Vietnam.
I almost kind of feel like that's, you know, just thinking about it now, I didn't really realize how many similarities there were between the two, but they're both movies about the Vietnam War that take on very like mythic dimensions.
Yes, and more so Apocalypse Now, but I see what you mean in certain areas of Platoon.
I don't know that I'd agree. I almost feel, I mean, we'll get into this a bit later, but I almost feel like Platoon is almost a spiritual movie. Like,
interesting.
There's some very heavy-handed Christian symbolism going on here.
I didn't pick up on that at all, so I'm gonna be interested to see what you want to talk about with that. The other movie that we'll compare this to, because it's another personal favorite of mine, is Full Metal Jacket.
I've never seen that one.
Oh, so good. It's one of my favorite Stanley Kubrick movies. And Full Metal Jacket, again, is more cinematically exciting. It's got a wit to it, like a humor that's kind of like uncompromising throughout.
Me so horny.
Yeah, stuff like that. And there's like some really great performances. But again, it kind of, maybe it shows that It's more similar to this movie in the sense that it shows like the war is hell aspect and the horrible things that it does to people. But it's definitely a more exciting, kick-ass kind of movie. Like, you feel good by the end of it, kind of, in a way. Like, I felt like by the end of it, I was like, yeah, that was a great movie. I'm so pumped that I watched that. Whereas this, I walked out and like, again, I said earlier, it was like a punch in the gut. Like, this whole movie, I was so unsettled and just like disturbed by everything that I was watching that it left me with a lot of thoughts and a lot of thinking. Whereas I walk out of Full Metal Jacket and the first half of it, like, there's a lot of thinking, and then the second half of it is just like a generic war movie, but with Stanley Kubrick-esque control over it.
Kubrick-esque shenanigans.
Yeah, exactly. So comparing very specific Vietnam movies, I think it's an interesting film to watch in contrast to those two films, because like you said, there's some similarities between each of them maybe, but there's also very stark differences with how they maybe portray war as well. So I think we've beaten to death who this movie is for. When to watch. This movie is really engrossing. Like, it's hard to look away, so I think it's something you don't want to get distracted from, because I think it takes away from
the experience.
Yeah, the experience. Like, I think you have to be fully there for it, and you have to be open to just watching everything that's happening, because of the way that the plot of the film kind of moves along. It's sometimes, as a civilian, hard to follow like what the mission of the platoon is, what they're doing exactly. So I think if you were to, like, you know, flip through your phone for 5 minutes, that you might get even more confused about like where the plot's heading.
Don't leave your phone in the other room. Don't check your phone. You're gonna forget what's going on.
Yeah.
In fact, like, let's just make that a rule for all movies. Like, I was watching a movie recently where I checked my phone halfway through, and then I looked up and I was like, wait, what happened? Like, what's going on?
Yeah. If you're ever sitting in a movie with me and you ask me what's happening and I've watched you sit on your phone for like 20 minutes, you're not going to get a good response from me.
Yeah, that's totally fair.
When to watch this movie?
I watched it on a Sunday afternoon.
And I think that's the good point to watch it.
Yeah.
I would agree. This is a Sunday afternoon kind of movie. Because I don't think I could sleep after watching this for a couple of hours, probably. Because there's a lot of thoughts bouncing around my head. And, like, just with how disturbing everything is. Like, it's something that I wouldn't want to just quickly pivot to going to bed afterwards. And it's not a late night movie either, because of how dense the film is in terms of the material.
Yeah.
So I think Sunday afternoon is kind of perfect. Even like a Sunday night, like, kind of thing. Like, yeah, I think you want to be fully present for it. You don't want to be tired or ready to go to bed or distracted at all. But it's also not like a blockbuster movie.
Again, I think this is where you and I are diverging on this movie. I don't think I found it nearly as emotionally affecting as you did.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Which is weird.
I probably could have taken a nap after watching this movie.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
We're going to have to dive into the filmography of Mike at some point and get an idea of, like, A, what are your favorite movies, old movies particularly? B, what unsettles you? Also, I'm kind of fascinated by.
I'm a high-functioning sociopath, so not much unsettles me. It's funny, you and I watched, what was that horror movie we watched recently? The one that you thought was really scary?
Oh, The Conjuring.
Yeah, we watched The Conjuring, and yeah, I found it very unsettling, but I was like, like, you know.
Oh, that's a solid horror movie. That's a classic.
It's a good horror movie. I just wasn't that frightened by it.
That's fair. I've got a horror movie that I watched recently that I don't want to talk about quite yet, because I think it might end up in my best of for this year.
Okay,
so
keep your secrets.
I will. Where to watch? Currently, the movie is streaming in a few different places. You have some options here with this one. If you've got a library subscription online, you could get it through Hoopla. The free movie website Tubi is streaming it currently, which is a pretty cool website. It's got ads throughout the movie. Like, you're going to take like a 10-second ad here and there.
I've never heard of it.
For free, it's pretty sick. And then MGM through the Prime channel. You could view it through there. All right. That is it for the spoiler free. I think this is going to be an interesting conversation, because obviously this is a bit more of a niche movie, again, that we're doing. And you and I, it sounds like, have maybe very different opinions of what this movie
Yeah, it's almost like we saw different movies.
Yeah, I don't think we did necessarily. I just think that I appreciated more of the aspects of what the film was doing than you did, potentially.
Yeah, and again, it's not so much I respect this movie, I just don't necessarily like it.
Yeah, and that's fair. And I think that's a very fair take on Platoon. So before we get into that, though, we'll say here that this is the cutoff point. If you're interested in seeing Platoon and you don't want any spoilers, turn off the podcast now. Come back later when you've watched the movie. If you're not interested to watch the movie, there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about anyway, so stick around. Either way, we'll see you in a bit. So I think with our spoiler talk, I again kind of want to do a similar start here where we talk about in front of the camera before we move back to behind the camera, behind the scenes. And so we'll talk a little bit about plot, kind of some of the interesting points of the movie, and maybe some of the really good quotes in this, because there are some really cool quotes that are from this film. Let's talk about, I guess, the construction of the film and how this film plays out. It essentially plays out in almost like 3 parts, and they're kind of based around Charlie Sheen's character's points at which he's in Vietnam. There's the first initial days of him landing on Vietnam and being placed within the platoon. Then there's him getting wounded, him returning a few weeks after he's been in the medical wing, and then they're back at base camp. They go out on a mission, and then we get the last point in the film, which is the big epic battle, essentially.
Yeah, I don't know if epic's the right word for it, but it's certainly a battle.
It's chaotic.
Yes.
Maybe not epic, but chaotic. We really only see a few days of time in Chris's experience, but they're all very traumatic and very impactful experiences that he has in Vietnam.
Yes.
When he's there, he's green, he's the junior member, and we kind of get the backdrop narration. Well, I was going to actually ask you about that. What do you think of Charlie Sheen's narration throughout the film?
I call that, and I'm going to raise you. I'm just going to say this. I don't really buy Charlie Sheen as a dramatic actor. I found his acting kind of lackluster in this movie.
I think that I agree with you on that.
Yeah, and part of it may just be the fact that perhaps Charlie Sheen, the personality, has overtaken Charlie Sheen, the actor from the 80s, but I just did not find his performance all that compelling.
So
I don't necessarily notice performances in movies. It's kind of like score. If you're doing a good job, I'm not really going to notice, right? I'm not the kind of guy who's typically blown away by actors. I care more about the writing, the dialogue, the story. But I did find his acting
it's a little hollow.
Wooden. Yeah.
So I'll say 2 things to that. The first is that I'm holding Charlie Sheen up on a little bit of a pedestal here because I've seen Apocalypse Now probably almost a dozen times now.
Yep.
And Martin Sheen is definitely a superior actor.
Oh yeah.
Especially in such a similar type of role, in such a similar situational role.
Yeah.
It's such a contrast between what each of them does with their characters and also what they're given with each of their characters that I definitely got to give to Martin Sheen.
Part of it could also just be that I found his motivations a little vague and lacking,
But I will say I think that was intentional, though, as well, because
Sure.
all of the characters, we don't really know much about anybody outside of the war. We get little tidbits here and there, but that's not important to the story.
Perhaps, yes.
The other pedestal that I will say that you put him on is that Tom Berenger and
Willem Dafoe.
Yeah, those two put on such great performances that he does get overshadowed by both of them.
Yeah, you're in your varsity high school swim team, but you're competing against Olympic swimmers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Chris's narration, or Charlie Sheen's narration, I think the dialogue is really great. It's just I don't know if he knew exactly how to deliver it 100%.
So he's writing letters to his grandmother.
Yeah.
And he just seems kind of whiny and bratty.
But that's the person who he is, right? He's like you said, he's a potentially rich and spoiled college dropout who's gone to war to see what the human experience is like, essentially. And when he gets there, he's put through hell in his first few days. Like, he recognizes that him as a fresh recruit on the ground does not, his life does not hold the same value as the rest of the members in the platoon.
Yeah, it's almost like there's a really interesting scene early on when, like, the commanding officers, Willem Dafoe, Dr. Cox, and Tom Berenger, and the lieutenant are talking. And they're kind of like deciding who they're going to send to investigate what will probably turn out to be an ambush. And the lieutenant's like, oh, let's send like the new recruits. And Willem Dafoe is like, hey, these guys have no idea what they're doing. Like, they're going to get slaughtered if we send them.
Yeah.
Right? But it's also kind of just like, I think Tom Berenger Barnes is just kind of like, well, like, you know, it's like my guys are being hammered. They know what they're doing. They're useful soldiers. Yeah, screw it. Let's send the cannon fodder.
Yeah, exactly.
Something like that. They're essentially just being thrown at the war machine. Like, they're being reduced to meat, essentially.
Yeah.
Which is kind of one of the ways the movie shows us right off the bat that Willem Dafoe's character, Elias, is kind of, he's framed as the compassionate, idealistic sergeant contrasted against the more cynical, brutal Barnes. One of my favorite scenes, actually, early on is Charlie Sheen is really struggling with carrying his equipment, and Elias comes over to him and he says, like, oh, like, you took all this extra crap with you. He's like, here, man, I'll carry it for you, but next time check with me. You don't need all this stuff.
Right.
And that's a really, it's a really good way, storytelling wise, of showing that Elias is a really good, compassionate guy right off the bat. And also what's funny is Willem Dafoe, he's such a great actor. He's plays villains a lot of the time, but like when he's like, showing mercy and warmth to Charlie Sheen, you believe it.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, he plays a nice guy so well.
Yeah.
It's really hard not to care about him in this movie.
Easily, yeah. This is probably my second favorite Willem Dafoe performance, which is saying something.
Yes.
And I think this isn't something that I said earlier, but maybe I should have, that I think if you're at all interested in Willem Dafoe in particular's filmography, this is a really cool film to check out because it's in contrast to, like you said, a lot of the other films that he's done.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere that I think at the time Tom Berenger was more known for playing heroic characters and Willem Dafoe was more known for playing villainous characters, and he deliberately cast them against type.
Exactly, and that is exactly what they did, and it worked really effectively in both cases. I think even if you have problems with the film, I think those two, their performances and their characters are not something that I would have any complaints about.
No, and perhaps that's maybe one of the problems, but also not problems I had with the movie, is that I found Charlie Sheen, Chris Taylor to be very underwhelming and wooden. But really, the real meat of the movie is the conflict between Sergeant Elias, played by Willem Dafoe, and Sergeant Barnes, played by Tom Berenger.
I will say, though, in fairness, on the other side of things, having Charlie Sheen's character come in as almost a blank slate, and you don't really know right off the bat where his character is going to go and where he's going to end up, like which camp he's going to end up in, Camp Elias or Camp Barnes. I think that's also somewhat interesting and something to keep you a little bit more captivated in watching where his character ends up in the film.
Yes, I think Chris Taylor, the character, is absolutely essential to making this movie work. I just think maybe Charlie Sheen was not up to the task.
Yeah,
he didn't have enough He didn't have enough tiger blood flowing through his veins at the time.
Yeah, it's his dialogue that always somewhat kills me. And I don't know, maybe it's just his voice and knowing like the history of him the last 10, 15 years that it's somewhat hard to get by that, but I don't know.
Yeah,
I would say that's my biggest fault.
You keep expecting him to like pull on a pair of cargo shorts and that like dorky golf shirt he always weared and like play the piano and complain about his brother Alan.
Yeah.
and have sex with way too many women.
Yeah, this is a film that is a performance that becomes weird in hindsight. And obviously this is the era for performances that become weird in hindsight.
And perhaps that's not this movie's fault, but it was a bit of a hurdle for me to overcome.
Yeah.
But just jumping ahead perhaps a little bit, I do think... So the real conflict in this movie is between Sergeant Barnes and Sergeant Elias.
Right.
And this is where I think this movie really leans into the heavy-handed Christian symbolism.
And I'm interested in that, and I want to know why you think that.
Okay, well, first of all, Sergeant Elias, played by Willem Dafoe, is framed as a Christ figure quite overtly throughout the movie.
And I think that I know what you're talking about, the point that you're talking about, but I want you to say why you what point particular and why you think so.
Okay, first of all, I just want to point out Oliver Stone was not being subtle with this point. Like, very early on, we mentioned there's that scene early on where the commanding officers are talking about throwing the new recruits to the wolves.
Right.
And Sergeant Elias vouches for the new guys and tries to protect them. And then kind of Sergeant Barnes and like the bad guys, quote unquote, kind of go off. And Dr. Cox says, he thinks he's fucking Jesus Christ. And I'm like, really, guys? You just came right out and say it. There's another scene where I forget who it is. It's Barnes or Dr. Cox. They literally say, he's a water walker. Water walker, which is a term which means someone who's morally inflexible.
Well, and that's something that comes up quite a bit, not only in the context of this movie, but also in like the Vietnam War. There was definitely some differing opinions in how the Vietnam War should have been run and like the motivations behind the people there as well.
Absolutely.
Right? Like, so I think, yes, you're right, but I think the reason why they were saying that was in the sense of like the unpopularity towards the war and how some people were there for maybe slightly nefarious purposes or
Absolutely.
reasons, or had the kind of personalities that in war are maybe effective in completing their engagements, but are really devastating to the local communities and the people who are unfortunately put in the crossfires of war.
Right.
So I don't know if I disagree with you, because I don't know if I can fully say that they weren't going for the Jesus aspect, the Christ aspect. But
look, trust me. Like, when Elias gets killed, there's that famous shot where he like lifts his arms up towards the heavens. I had a film professor who said every time a character in a movie lifts his arms up horizontally with his shoulders, it's Jesus.
All right.
Like,
and this is where I thought you were going to go.
Right. It's a crucifixion image. Also,
yes, but before you move on from this, I do want to actually highlight something very important to this scene. The scene where that occurred, where his hands up are like that, is actually based on a real picture from 1968 in Vietnam. It's one of the most famous war pictures ever taken by Art Greenspon. So if you want to check the picture out, I would just Google Art Greenspon 1968 and you'll see the picture. And it is basically like exactly like that.
Arms up.
It's in Vietnam. Like, so very specifically, that's the reference there. So I thought that's maybe where you're going from that. And interesting enough, they actually reference that in the movie Tropic Thunder, where he puts his arms like that. It's a direct reference
That's
to
a great
the movie
movie as
Platoon.
well.
So I can see where you're coming from with that, but I think that there's enough backstory to that particular moment in time where I wouldn't give that the Christ connection, essentially.
Right. There's also literally the first shot where he comes in. He's got his rifle slung around his shoulders, and he's doing this.
Okay, all right, I'll give you that one.
It's Jesus dragging his cross.
All right,
so
all right,
and
fair enough.
I'm not, and like, look, stories all have multiple layers to them. I'm not saying that Willem Dafoe, Sergeant Elias, is literally Jesus. I mean, he's framed as a Christ-like figure.
Okay,
and he's a flawed Christ-like figure in the sense that he's a relatively compassionate guy. He looks after the new recruits. he's clearly troubled by the role he takes in the war. He stands in opposition to the more brutal Sergeant Barnes, but he's still a soldier fighting for a very flawed, very morally questionable war.
Well, and that's where we get a really good discussion, actually. Like, one of my favorite scenes of the film is when him and Chris are having the conversation back and forth about what the war means.
Yes.
Like, and they flat out say, like, that him and Barnes have very different ways of how they look at things. And he flat out says, like, I think we're going to lose this war. And I think Americans have been kicking ass long enough that we deserve one loss in our on our bench.
And I think what's so interesting about the conflict between Elias and Barnes is I almost feel that Elias represents kind of, perhaps it's not appropriate to say the idealism of war, but he represents, like, you know, the principles of war. Like, he's got a sense of honor to him. The whole conflict between Elias and Barnes starts because Barnes leads the men into this village, and he holds a gun to a little girl's head to get some suspected Viet Cong member to confess. Elias shows up and kicks the crap out of him because he's so enraged by this. Mm-hmm. There's a scene later on where Barnes is gloating. He's drunk and he's gloating / challenging Elias's friends after he's killed him, spoiler alert, where he basically says, I am reality, which is a great war. It's almost so much Elias represents sort of the idealism or the principles of war, whereas Barnes represents the cold brutality of war.
Yeah, and they're very opposing ideas, and you're boiling things down to exactly what I think Oliver Stone was intending, and the messages that he was trying to get across. And at the end of the day, Barnes kind of wins.
Barnes absolutely wins, and I can jump right into this if you want.
Yeah, go for it. You sound passionate.
Yeah. So, sort of the issue I have with this movie, maybe not the issue, but is, like I said, there's Chris Taylor, Charlie Sheen, Mr. Tigerblood, the new recruit, and then we've got not Jesus Christ, a.k.a. Elias, a.k.a. Willem Dafoe.
Yeah.
And then we've got Tom Berenger, a.k.a. Barnes, the cold brutality of war. And with Chris, we see that he's sort of, in the final narration, he says, I'm the child of two fathers, meaning Elias and Barnes. But what's interesting is that he seems like a relatively decent guy for the most part. But we also see that during conflict, he tends to fly off the handle.
Yeah.
He's got temper. During the final battle, he goes to town.
Yeah.
He gets caught up in...
I mean, it's kill or be killed in that situation.
But even beyond that, he's got very clear bloodlust.
Yeah.
Like, he's into it. Like, there's a scene, I think, in the final battle where he's firing away at the Viet Cong and his squad mate just runs away.
Right.
And then after Barnes kills Elias, spoiler alert, there's a scene where Elias's friends, including Chris Taylor, kind of hang out in this place called the Underworld. Again, very mythic dimensions. Mm-hmm. Barnes shows up drunk. That's where he gives his whole I am reality speech.
Yeah.
And he basically challenges Chris, like, why don't you fight me right now and try
kill
and
me.
kill me.
He tells them all, kill him.
Kill him. And Chris flies off the handle, tries to fight him, gets his ass kicked.
Right.
And Barnes spares him. And then there's a scene, there's one character, I forget what his name is, but he's sort of he kind of is framed as like kind of a mystic shaman type character, one of Elias's friends. And he's talking about Barnes. He's like, Barnes is crazy. He's been shot 7 times and he can't die. And he says specifically, only Barnes can kill Barnes. And then there's a big final battle. Everybody's wounded. But Barnes survives, and Chris Taylor, Charlie Sheen survives. And after the final battle, he has almost an identical scar to Barnes on the right side of his face. And he goes to Barnes, and Barnes is wounded, and he's like, get me a medic. And Chris has got murder in his eye.
Yeah.
And Barnes just says, do it. And
no hesitation.
Chris kills him in exactly the same way. 3 shots in the stomach, in the chest. Same exact way Barnes killed Elias.
And it was quick. And that scene is really good. I really like that scene because it's so quick and it's so like he doesn't even debate it at all. Like it's so much more real feeling. Like it
Right.
packs more of a punch than like, oh, I don't like that inner. You don't see the inner conflict at that point. It's gone. Like you said, there's that murderous intent in his eyes.
Right. And then the movie ends with Charlie Sheen hopping on a helicopter and ascending into the sky. We
Right.
fade to white at the end. Very clearly framed as early in the movie, he says, I'm in hell. And then the movie ends with him getting on a helicopter and going up into the sky, fade to white. So it's clearly like ascending from hell, that sort of thing. But he says as his final narration, I'm a child of two fathers. Maybe the issue I have with Chris Taylor, or even with that final narration, is like, no, dude, you're Barnes. You have become Barnes. Only Barnes can kill Barnes. You are Barnes.
Interesting.
He's got a scar on the same side of his face that Barnes has at the end.
That's a really interesting take. I really appreciate that, because I don't know if I would have put all of that together myself, to be honest.
Right.
And I can't disagree with you. I don't think and you know what? I think that's also part of the point of the movie is that can a person like Elias exist in a war? And
well, the issue I had with the ending potentially is he ascends into the sky in a helicopter. He says, I'm a child of two fathers, blah, 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 but we have to do our part to build a better world, et cetera, et cetera. And then fade to white. And it's like, this movie is dedicated to the men who fought in Vietnam. And to me, something about the ending felt a little disingenuous in the sense that, at least my reading of the ending is, Chris Taylor has essentially child of two fathers. We've got Elias, the idealism of war, or the principles of war, and then we've got Barnes, the cold savagery of war. And to me, it's obvious, like, Chris has chosen Barnes.
Right.
He has become Barnes. So when he ascends and he's like, we have to do our part to build a better world, I'm like, bitch, you're Barnes. Like, you're going to be the Barnes of the next generation. Like, in a sense, Barnes won.
Yeah.
He sort of passed on his torch. Perhaps it even points to the whole idea that a guy like Elias can't really exist in a war like Vietnam.
Yeah, and that's what I was kind of saying, yeah.
Or a war at all. Like, there's a bunch of stuff going on with Putin right now, and one of my friends pointed out a few months ago when all this stuff was going on, it's like, as a society and as a global community, we've got all these rules about war and what's appropriate and what's not. But, like, what do you do with a guy like Putin who's just going to flip the board over and play by his own rules?
Right. Yeah.
You know what I mean? So what struck me as a bit disingenuous about the ending is, early on in the movie, he says, I'm in hell. And then he gets on a helicopter, flies away, fade to white. To me, what would have been more appropriate ending is if he didn't get on the helicopter, he stays on the ground in Vietnam, gets made a sergeant or whatever, and then fade to black. It's like, no, dude.
And that definitely supports your idea of who Chris is by the end of the film. But that flying away kind of thing, maybe that leaves that little hint of maybe he's not all bad. Maybe he really is the child of two fathers. And there's some good left in him.
Perhaps it's also, Oliver Stone served in Vietnam. He dedicates the movie to the men who fought in Vietnam. Oliver might have thought of it as spitting in the face of his friends if it's just like, nope, we're in hell. We're bad people.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I was actually reading this some point this week, and it actually comes back and relates to this, that the sunk cost fallacy and how it maybe relates to something like Vietnam and the war. And you have these families who are back home who have lost brothers and husbands and fathers, all of the losses that have happened over Vietnam. And you look to the significant others and the parents and everybody else, and they ask the government, like, was my child's sacrifice like worth it, or did they die in vain? Did their death have meaning, kind of thing? And so if you just look at it as Chris's Barnes and what Elias did held no weight in who Chris became, then yeah, he's dead. There's nothing there, kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's a heavy message to come away from with the movie, but that's certainly...
And so there's that little bit of that pull away at the end, and maybe you didn't appreciate it because it felt disingenuous, I think, but I kind of see maybe why they did the end the way they did, because there's a little bit of that pullback that, you know, there's maybe some sort of meaning here that we don't just completely write off the people who are there.
No, and I would never, you know, if by chance there's a Vietnam War vet listening, I would never write that off or diminish someone's sacrifice or someone's valor. It's
Right.
just, for me, the whole movie is really, this is what I mean when I say this is a very heavy-handed Christian movie. And it's almost kind of like Elias is the angel on Chris's shoulder and Barnes is the devil on his shoulder. For me, when it comes to Chris's character arc, he essentially chose the devil.
Right.
In order to avenge the angel, but hey, that he still chose the devil. Like I said, he kills Barnes exactly the same way that Barnes killed Elias.
Yeah. Very
And
much in cold blood.
there is kind of a sense also at the end of the movie, Dr. Cox spends the whole battle hiding under a dead body, and then afterwards he goes up to the commander, and the commander's like, "Oh, cool, you're in charge now," and he has this look on his face like, "Oh fuck." Like,
yeah, which is actually his character arc is maybe one of the most comical arcs of the movie. I very much appreciated his character in his arc. I actually wrote down the quote where he is basically trying to leave the war early and get approval from Barnes.
Yeah, because he has a bad feeling about it.
Yeah, he says, "Bob, I got a bad feeling on this one, all right? I mean, I got a bad feeling. I don't think I'm going to make it out of here. You understand what I'm saying?" And Barnes looks at him and goes, "Everybody got to die sometime, right?"
Yeah.
And, like, just to see his cowardice in hiding and surviving and being one of the only people to survive the platoon that night.
At the same time, can you even call it cowardice? Like, I mean, you know, hey, he survived. Like, he hid under a dead body, but he survived.
Yeah,
like,
that's fair. That's fair. But anyway, going back actually to basically that discussion that they have leading up to the "I am reality" quote in that scene.
I am reality.
The term that's used is fragging Barnes.
Yeah.
That's actually a real term, and it comes out of a real historically significant point of Vietnam, is that basically, like, that actually happened relatively frequently.
On Joe Rogan, Oliver Stone said that there was a lot of friendly fire that went on.
Yeah, where soldiers would especially kill their superiors, and the reason why they call it fragging was because often it was with frag grenades, and it was they tried to make it look like an accident kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It was suspected to have happened around 900 times at least between 1969 and 1972, when the war was really becoming unpopular.
Yikes.
And again, people were having that disconnect between the orders they were given and what they were wanted to do and were supposed to do, right?
Okay, I also want to point out that literally one of the first things that happens in the first scene in the movie is Chris Taylor arrives at Vietnam and we see a snake slithering between his legs.
Right.
This is what I mean when I say that, like, this movie is not subtle with its heavy-handed Christian symbolism.
Okay, all right. I'll give it to you. You've sold me on your idea here.
So I'm just kind of thinking about it now. That is kind of interesting in terms of how both Apocalypse Now and Platoon are almost kind of fables about the nature of man or the nature of good and evil set against the backdrop of the Vietnam War.
And I kind of understand why, because of how controversial of a war it is. The fact that the U.S. did not decisively win it, so there's all these questions that get raised after it. Like, again, was there any point to all of this?
Yeah, really.
So, all right. I don't have any more plot left to talk about necessarily. I think we hit all of the biggest plot beats. Otherwise, any other favorite scenes that you want to mention?
I did really appreciate the scene where Barnes murders Sergeant Elias, in terms of how we see these parallel shots of Elias and he's running from left to right, and Barnes is running from right to left. That's how you know Barnes is a bad guy, because he's running from right to left. No, seriously, that's a film language thing. If a character is moving from left to right, that's good. He's moving in the right direction. If he's moving from right to left, that's bad. He's moving in the wrong direction. It's apparently something that makes sense. Yeah.
Old classical film stuff. All right. Well, that's a good segue into effects and filming, I think. let's start with where this film comes out of. Obviously, Oliver Stone, from his experiences in Vietnam, he started writing it back in 1968, like right after he finished his experience at the war. And so the original form of the film starts with a semi-biographical screenplay that he wrote called Break. And he actually sent this screenplay off to a few people to try to get it made, most notably to Jim Morrison of The Doors, who was originally intending to play Chris Taylor. However, as we all know, Jim Morrison died pretty tragically.
Joined the 27 Club.
He did, and where he died in his apartment, he had the script on him at the time.
Wow.
Actually. So
it was so bad it killed him.
Yeah, I guess so.
That was tasteless.
So in the 70s, Stone ended up rewriting this a few times, and he, like you mentioned earlier, he actually couldn't get the financing, and the main reason for that was due to the war's unpopularity with the American public. And allegedly, there was a potential at one point for it to be directed by Sidney Lumet, the director that I did.
Oh, your boy.
In the draft episode. And Al Pacino almost potentially could have starred in that version of this film.
You know what? Al Pacino would have made a fantastic Chris Taylor.
A much better Chris,
and
I
I
agree.
know that because it's almost the same character arc as Michael Corleone.
Neat.
But
yeah, you're not necessarily wrong there. But by the time that this film actually was created in the mid-'80s, somebody like Al Pacino was too old for the role of Chris.
That's also a good point.
That was...
It's also, what is the relationship to this movie and the Rambo movies? Like, when did Rambo First Blood Part 2 come out? Because that's essentially...
I don't know off the top of my head.
I
know the other movies, but...
Yeah, because that's almost... it's almost kind of funny how Rambo First Blood Part 2 is a shameless action movie about a Vietnam War vet.
1982 First Blood. Part 2 probably came out like very quickly. 1985, yeah.
Okay, so this would have been a year before this movie. So you've got Sylvester Stallone with a dumb perm and a bandana, and he's...
Well, this movie is a heavy response as well to some of the other films in the glorification of war.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Just how... which isn't to say that First Blood Part 2 is totally flippant.
So the other kind of based in historic points that the film directly references or based on Oliver Stone's actual experiences, I did want to highlight a few of these. So the fact that Chris was injured early and then returned, that was actually something that happened to Stone, and I believe it happened to him twice as well. The scene where Chris saves the girl from being raped actually was also based on a real point in Oliver Stone's military career.
Yeah, that was perhaps the most brutal and the most unsettling scene for me.
Yeah, and I would agree it's up there
with
my most unsettling scenes. And it's, like I said, it's also based on a real experience that he had. And that's probably also why it becomes so unsettling, because watching that scene, you're like, yeah, I believe that scene could happen. And that's where the unsettling moments are always grounded in real life stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
The other last kind of piece that I wanted to mention was the final battle is actually based on a real battle called the New Year's Day Battle of 1968. So very, very similar in terms of what happened during that battle and the loss of life during that battle as well.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of filming, they started off by putting the actors through a boot camp. So it was like a really intense, like actual military training camp. They had to dig foxholes. They had to do marches and nighttime ambushes, just like in Vietnam. And they used like the special effects explosions during those to unsettle people.
Wow.
Basically, like they wanted to put them through like 30 days of hell before they started shooting, so that all of them were like the tired, burnt out kind of military soldiers that would have actually been in Vietnam.
And jumping off of this point, I also read somewhere that Oliver Stone was famously pretty brutal to everyone on this film.
Yeah, he was universally hated on set of the film. And a lot of it came down to actually people noting that he was definitely under a lot of stress while he was filming this. And he also very obviously was struggling from some sleep deprivation combined with his own PTSD of the war.
Yeah.
While shooting this.
Jesus Christ.
He was, very erratic all over the place throughout this movie. Very difficult to work with, famously.
I think I read somewhere, and I might be wrong, that like, you know, Johnny Depp, he made Johnny Depp so nervous that he wanted to throw up.
Yeah, that actually is true. And he was so nervous that he almost wanted to throw up, and then he made Johnny Depp do the scene again.
Do it again.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, I guess, man, when you were a director in the old days, you could just get away with murder.
Oh, absolutely.
He probably could have shot Johnny Depp, and they would have just replaced him.
Well, think about the horror stories of working with like Stanley Kubrick.
Oh,
right?
yeah, like that shit don't fly nowadays.
No, definitely not. The other cool thing about the way that it was filmed, and that also maybe played with the psyches of the actors, is that it was filmed sequentially as well, which you don't often see in movies.
No.
And so as soon as your character was killed off, you were sent home. That was it. So it was basically like a feeling of like your friends being killed and then being sent home. Like that felt like real on set, because they just left the production. So like Charlie Sheen's emotions at the end when he's leaving in the helicopter are real, because he's like finally getting to leave.
He was genuinely crying at the end, right?
Yeah,
I think I remember reading that as well. Yeah.
Because he was finally getting to leave this production.
God, I don't have to work with Oliver Stone anymore.
Yeah, so he really dug deep for that one, and or maybe didn't have to dig that deep.
Yeah, I guess there was no human resources department on hand.
No.
But
the helmets. I want to talk about the helmets as well, because everybody, and I've seen this in other Vietnam War movies, how people would write on their helmets different quotes. Sometimes they can be hard to see in movies, so I often, like with Vietnam War movies, end up going and reading what the quotes were afterwards. So Charlie Sheen's helmet was, "When I die, bury me upside down so the world can kiss my ass."
Yeah, I remember that one.
Johnny Depp's was Sherilyn, which was
the name of his girlfriend at the time, right?
Exactly. Yeah, Sherilyn Fenn.
So sweet. I hope she didn't poop in his bed. Oh, contemporary reference.
Zing. Mark Moses, the lieutenant, had on his helmet a drawing of the Mad Magazine mascot.
Oh, yeah.
And it said, "What, me worry?" And apparently Oliver Stone laughed really hysterically once when he read that. So
that's pretty funny.
Yeah. So those are the main helmet. The last kind of piece, effects and filming wise, that I wanted to talk about was not only were Oliver Stone's personal experiences used in this film heavily, but the character of Bunny, the kind of psychotic character that Kevin Dillon plays.
Oh, I completely forgot about that guy.
Yeah, we haven't talked about him
but he's
at all,
almost the most terrifying character in the whole movie.
Yeah, because he's borderline psychotic.
Yeah.
And he just does whatever with no consequence.
He's like Barnes, but almost worse.
Yeah, because Barnes does things with a reason and a purpose, and it's like scary because you can justify some of his logic.
You almost kind of get the sense that Barnes kind of hates himself a little bit too, whereas Bunny is just like, whatever, like,
let's just kill it. And did you see his brains? I just like knocked his brains out. Look at those.
Yeah, and then there's that really great scene kind of halfway through where he murders that woman, and even Dr. Cox, one of Barnes's kind of...
That's what I mean, yeah.
Yeah, his henchman, he's terrified. He's like, we don't talk about this.
Yeah.
Like, let's get out of here. We do not talk about what just happened.
Exactly, yeah. So him in particular, there was a book called Nom by Mark Baker, which were firsthand collections of soldiers' stories that were put in this book, published in the 80s. So good kind of side piece of literature to read if you're interested. So the line, "The only worry you had was dying, and if that happened, you wouldn't know it anyway. So what the fuck?" That actually comes from a real line from that book that a soldier had said.
Yeah, there's a scene where Bunny is talking to one of the characters, and he sort of says something to the effect of like, "Yeah, I went to confession and talked to a priest and admitted that I love killing."
Yeah.
And he almost kind of reminds me of Todd from Breaking Bad, and that like there's something very like boyish about him, but also very like psychotic. It's not so much that he's evil, it's the idea that like he couldn't even comprehend good and evil. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way of putting it. It's just like, whatever, I like killing people. Here I am killing people.
Yeah.
And like, again, you kind of get the sense during that big I Am Reality speech, to me anyway, I kind of got the sense that like there was almost kind of a sadness to Barnes.
Yes.
Like he's almost, when he's saying like kill me, you almost kind of get the sense of like, oh, this guy's in pain in some way, right? Whereas Bunny is just a bunny. Like he's having a great time.
Yeah.
Just living his best life in Vietnam.
Yeah, his best murderous life.
Yeah, and I mean, you can almost kind of respect that.
Sure, why not?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move into score. The score is pretty melancholy throughout.
It's very
dramatic.
Classical.
Yeah,
There's this one song they keep coming back to.
Yeah, it's Adagio for Strings by Samuel Barber.
Doesn't ring a bell.
Yeah, from the 1920s, I believe.
Fun.
Overall, yeah, so most of the score was made by George Delarue, pretty prominent film and TV show composer. He did 351 films, TV shows, and documentaries. So,
oh, wow.
Quite a number under his belt.
Wow, okay.
A lot of them being French as well as American. It was a pretty good mix.
Interesting.
When I was reading through. The one song that I want to highlight in here is the use of White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane when they're smoking weed down in their personal bunker the first time it plays.
The Underworld?
Yeah. It's the song used by the new Matrix movie in the trailer. It was very widely...
I'm going to have to look that up after we're done recording.
Yeah.
Doesn't ring a bell.
It's a movie, or it's a song from that time period, and it's become one of my favorite like retro songs that I've found this year.
Interesting.
Let's talk some legacy.
Hey.
So the film itself won 4 Oscars for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Sound, and Best Film Editing.
Really? It won all those?
All of those.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it was one of the biggest movies of the 1986. It, I believe, was Roger Ebert's 9th favorite film of... Oh, no. It was his favorite film of 1986, but it was his 9th favorite film of the 80s.
Okay. Tight.
I would agree with Best Director, Best Sound, Best Film Editing. I don't know what the other contenders were 1986 for the Oscars. So
yeah, neither of us were alive at the time, so...
Yeah, that doesn't necessarily help. Sequels, prequels, and reboots. There were no direct sequels to this.
How could there be?
But Oliver Stone did create like a trilogy of Vietnam War movies.
Oh, that's right.
So it's followed by Born on the 4th of July, which stars Tom Cruise, and Heaven and Earth, which stars Tommy Lee Jones. So if you really, really like this and you want to see more Vietnam War movies that are kind of probably in a similar-ish tone, like they're by the same director, he's going to have the same visual style, then go check those 2 out. I probably will check them out at some point.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, those are both pretty big actors.
I am kind of curious to see those movies because this definitely felt like a very definitive movie. Like, I don't understand, like, what more could Oliver Stone possibly have to say about Vietnam?
Yeah, and that's really fair. Like, I'm sure they would be interesting. There is one other related piece of filmography that I will mention to this, and that is a documentary that came out in 2018 called Platoon, Brothers in Arms.
What?
Which is just a full documentary into the making of the film.
Interesting.
And it's narrated by Charlie Sheen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Charlie Sheen. What have you been up to the last few years?
So you can watch it on Tubi and Plex right now. So if you're interested in like documentaries on films, then there's one available for this one.
That's very interesting. It's sort of like, because I mean, there's Hearts of Darkness, A Filmmaker's Apocalypse, which is all about the making of Apocalypse Now.
Yep.
And then, 40 years later, they did the same thing for Platoon?
Yeah, so Platoon is essentially just a full mirror of Apocalypse Now.
Maybe we should have done, a joint episode.
No, Apocalypse Now deserves its own episode.
Yeah, that's fair.
That's one of my favorite movies of all time.
Great.
Our personal reviews and the partner factor. I'm going to start with me first, because we know where you stand on this one. So,
oh, do we? Are you sure you don't want me to belabor the point a little?
No, I do want you to do that.
Okay.
But I'll give a very different opinion, because we've harped on quite a bit of this. Based on your feelings for the film. I think this is one of the most effective Vietnam War movies of all time.
Fair.
I think that in terms of providing representation for what it was like to truly be there. I think this is one of the best films for seeing that. And does that make the film a good, exciting movie to watch? Not necessarily, but that's where you and I come in with our earlier discussion about talking to new audiences about what to expect when you go in.
Yeah.
Because sometimes your expectations going into a movie can completely sink or swim your opinion of that movie.
Yeah, and like you told me, it's kind of funny. We were supposed to record this last Sunday, and
Yeah.
you said, "Do you want to come over and record?" And I said, "Okay." And then I was like, this asshole wants me to come over and record. He won't even tell me what the movie is. And then I said, "Wait, what movie?" And you said Platoon. I'm like, "Oh yeah, you told me like 2 weeks ago." So all I knew about Platoon was that it was a Vietnam movie. That's all I knew going in. Right. I didn't know Charlie Sheen or Willem Dafoe or Tommy Berenger were in it, but yes.
Yeah, and so knowing that this isn't a film that you're going to get excited about, that's going to make you like fist bump, like, like this is about heroes, like real American heroes and stuff. Like, knowing all of that going in, I think is really going to impact your viewing experience for the better. And like I said, I think this is a very strong Vietnam War movie. I think overall, it's a better film than Full Metal Jacket, which is probably one of, like, again, one of my favorite Stanley Kubrick movies, but I don't think it's more enjoyable to watch. And that's where, again, like we're kind of alluding to.
Well, I was just going to say, it's kind of like what I said, is that, like, I respect and I admire this movie, but I don't necessarily enjoy it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's kind of like, again, going back, weird comparison, but it's kind of like 8.5. It's like, I really respect the artistry and the techniques and the message, but it's not exactly a fun romp.
No, it's not a fun romp. And that's where I'll say, like, I'm glad that I watched this movie. This is almost a similar review as 8.5. I'm glad I watched it. I don't know if I'll ever go back to this one.
Yeah.
I appreciate everything that was done. I think it's a great war movie, but it is just so demanding.
Demanding is a great word for it.
Yeah, that it's hard. Whereas Full Metal Jacket and Apocalypse Now are films that I come back to over and over again. Like, I watch them probably every other year.
Oh, really?
Least. I love those two. Apocalypse Now is, in my opinion, probably the best Vietnam movie.
I think I would agree with that.
Even though I think this movie is more effective at telling the story of Vietnam, I think that Apocalypse Now is a better film. It's a cinematic experience.
Yeah, well, you've also got Marlon Brando giving, like, one of the most haunting performances of his life in Apocalypse Now. You don't really have an equivalent in this movie.
Yeah, and that's fair. That's agreeable. Even though, like, I still think that Willem Dafoe is a master at acting.
Oh, yeah, there's great performances.
Like I said, I think this is the best Vietnam War movie that I've personally seen, and then the other two references of my top ones are Full Metal Jacket, Apocalypse Now. I will say I haven't seen The Deer Hunter or Good Morning Vietnam yet either.
Oh, yeah, I haven't seen either of those either.
They're both definitely on my list. They're very, very important films with some very big actors attached to them. The Deer Hunter has Robert De Niro and
Christopher Walken.
Yeah, and John Cazale. Whereas Good Morning Vietnam is obviously Robin Williams.
I've been thinking we should do a Robin Williams movie one of these days.
Oh, I'm very open to doing a Robin Williams movie. There's so many actors that we just, like, in terms of time and trying to get to all of these big actors, like, it takes a while to get through people.
Yeah,
like, we're a year into this podcast at this point.
But we're doing our best.
We haven't done a Robin Williams movie. We haven't really done a Jack Nicholson movie. And there's other big actors like that. But anyway, yeah. So I think that I do need to see those before I would give, like, a definitive best, like, list of what I would watch. But in terms of, like, chronological order of when these films take place in Vietnam, I actually figured that out. So Platoon takes place first in chronological order. So if you wanted to watch, like, how the war developed, that would be the one that I would watch first.
Okay.
After that, Full Metal Jacket takes place actually just about immediately after the events of Platoon in terms of chronological order.
When you say chronological order, are you talking about, like, historical?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Platoon takes place in, I believe, 68, and then Full Metal Jacket's 69. Like, it's literally like a few weeks like after Platoon ends, basically.
Interesting.
And then Apocalypse Now is 1970, a couple years after, as the war's like winding down or starting to wind down. So it's at peak unpopularity.
So it's the Vietnam cinematic universe.
Yeah, exactly. So
okay.
You can check those out in that order if you want to watch it like that. Thought it was kind of neat. Like I said earlier, just checked out pretty early, so which is valid. Like I said, this isn't a escapism type of film.
This isn't a Jess movie.
Yeah. All right. I want your fully fleshed out review before we talk a couple other things.
Well, I've been pretty upfront about my feelings on this movie. I watched it on a Sunday afternoon in bed on my laptop. And yeah, like I said, I admire this movie. I don't necessarily think I enjoyed it that much. To me, this was almost kind of like a Christian morality fable as opposed to a full-blown war movie. I really see the symbolism and like the kind of mythological the mythic dimensions Oliver Stone was going for.
And I'm surprised that you, being the writer and being somebody who appreciates all of that you didn't enjoy this film more with reading into all of the deeper meaning behind everything.
Yeah,
and how it was framed.
Kind of funny. Maybe it's not so much that I think maybe, let me put a pin in it. I think maybe this movie was an emotional experience for you.
Yeah.
It was an intellectual experience for me.
Right. And that's definitely the difference.
Like, you were looking, maybe it's fair to say you were looking more at the story and I was looking at more of like kind of the lower level metaphors going on.
Yep.
Yeah, maybe it's not totally fair to say I didn't enjoy this movie. I just maybe appreciated it on a much more detached level.
Right.
Yeah, let's go with that. Detached level. Just me being detached, like all my girlfriends have complained about.
Nice. Okay, I think that is it for this episode.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this one more than Michael enjoyed this movie.
Well, to be fair, Blake, I am reality.
Yeah, sure. So, up and coming stuff that we have going on. I said this at the beginning of the episode, but the next episode is going to be the viewer's choice episode, which
that's right.
Really excited about. I've seen a few good suggestions so far. I think potentially top of our list right now might be The Green Mile, potentially. But if you have any ideas, leave them in the comments below. Send us a message on Facebook or Twitter, or wherever you get access to this podcast. I hope you can write a comment in there and we'll grab it, come up with a decision. We got to know pretty soon, because I think that episode airs December 1st. So probably within a week of this episode airing, we will be starting to record that episode. So,
that's right.
So get your stuff in ASAP, because we want to hear from you what you want us to watch. It could be like a movie that you've never seen before that you're really interested in, or maybe you don't know enough about, but you want to like understand what to know going in.
Or a movie you think we'd really like, or a movie you think we'd really hate.
Yeah, or a movie that you absolutely love.
Yeah.
Like that's honestly more or less the criteria that we have going into these films. Obviously, this is a podcast for people who haven't seen old movies, and us as young 30-somethings almost, trying to share our wealth of knowledge of old movies, and trying to bring them to modern audiences. So that's kind of our target. So that's what we kind of look for in a movie, and movies that maybe interest us that we've heard of and never watched. Or on the flip side, maybe it's a movie like The Thing, which I absolutely loved and wanted to bring it to the masses. So
absolutely.
So yeah, like I said, leave a comment wherever you find us or listen to us, and you may be our choice for our movie. So
yeah.
Anyway, I think that is it for us.
I think it may just be.
Cool. Well, have a good night, Rob. Now, that all spooled into like one word.
Wow, talk much?
Yeah. I'm like the hormone monster in Big Mouth.
No, that's more like... No, that's. Oh yeah, that guy.
Yeah.
Wow, I'm drawing
It's
a
over.
blank.
It's done. We're gone.
It's
Bye.
done. Cut it off.
All right.
Cut it all off.
Yeah.